Debate, reprise de débat, the Honourable Member for Esquimalt, Juan de Fuca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to rise in this debate today because this is a topic which I've been involved in for very many years, stretching back before I became a member of this House. And that's because of the work of a group in my riding called PEERS, the Prostitute Empowerment Education and Resource Society. They run a drop-in centre and an office which is in the municipality where I was a councillor. And everything that allows me to speak with some grounding today comes from my experience working with that group. And I want to thank them at the beginning of this speech for the time they've shared with me in helping me understand the realities of sex work in Canada. They are a peer-led drop-in centre and outreach program, meaning the sex workers themselves run these programs. And who better to try and work with people involved in the sex trade than those who have the credibility with their colleagues to talk about those kinds of realities. We've heard many things in the media discussions of this bill that clearly don't reflect the reality that sex workers face every day. Their outreach programs that they run are both day and night. The night programs are extremely important for the safety of sex workers. They do everything from involving sex workers in safe sex education and providing things like condoms, but also and keeping a check on where people involved in sex work are, and if they're not seen, for people to check on them and find out that they're safe. They also help compile a bad date list, which they disseminate. Bad date list meaning those men who have used violence against sex workers, so that sex workers can identify them and avoid becoming victims of violence. In their day programs, they do a lot of other things. And they're still continuing to operate these programs despite a very severe funding crunch, which has reduced the amount of money available to them and the number of hours that they can run their outreach day and night programs. And in fact, their day program has been reduced to 1 day a week. Now these services operate on a shoestring, and I can tell you that their drop-in centre is not a glamorous place with a large screen TV or many other of the things people might associate with a drop-in centre. Very, very basic kind of operation, and really runs on the volunteer services of people who are either sex workers themselves, who are allies, who are trying to make sure that those who are involved in sex work are as safe as they can possibly be. And for their efforts, PEERS was recognized by the Provincial Ministry of Justice with an award for leadership in crime prevention and community safety. So a recognition by the provincial government of the extremely important role that PEERS played in helping reduce crime and keep everybody in the community safer. PEERS came as an initiative of sex workers themselves, assisted by a woman who had been a long-time columnist with the Victoria Times columnist. Jody, who worked with him for many years, really got involved because of some of the work she was doing as a journalist. And she met sex workers and really found the difficulties they were having. And so she played a very large role in helping them get this centre together. So I first went to the PEERS Centre in my riding more than 5 years ago. And I got to see firsthand this wide range of services that they were offering. The very important role they played in getting access to health and social services in the community for primarily women, but also transgender women and some gay men, to get them connected with health services and social services. Quite often they lacked ID, they had been stolen, they lacked a fixed address, and because of all of those things, there were obstacles to getting the services that all of us would take for granted. And a very important role in helping them find housing. Victoria is a very expensive community, very limited housing options. And so one of the very important roles was for them to locate safe housing. Because I have to say, of course, one of the things that a lot of people aren't aware of is that many of the sex workers in my community are mothers with kids to support. And whatever you think about people involved in sex work, those mothers I met were just trying to put a roof over the head and food on the table. And one of them said to me very directly, you know, I have 3 kids. In a minimum wage part-time job, I can't put a roof over their head. I can't clothe them. I can't feed them. That's how I ended up in sex work. That's why I continue in sex work. It's for the future of my kids. And so when you've met someone like that, who's a volunteer at the center, helping other people make the best of the life and that they find themselves in at that time. I think that's very important because of the stigma that is placed generally on sex workers. So the drop-in center became a place which offers support for those who are involved in sex work, a safe place they can go, someone they can talk to, and a connection to the community to help end the isolation that many sex workers find themselves in. But the center also offers support for those who desire to leave the sex trade. And a very important part of what they do is identify those who want out, who may have gotten there through circumstances that are not so pleasant. But they end up at the center. The center would help them with basic access job training programs, access education, even to the point of preparing resumes to help them find a different kind of work and a different kind of employment. So all of these things go on because of the generosity of volunteers and the solidarity that sex workers in my community have shown for each other to help themselves out and to keep themselves safe. And a key part of everything that Peers does is harm reduction. And so education on safer sex, access to addiction counseling, and as I mentioned, collecting and disseminating bad date information about violent clients in my community. So when the Bedford decision was clearly approaching last fall, I decided that I need to get better informed about the issue. Now, I had been involved with Peers since I was a city councillor. They came to us and asked for a property tax exemption for their drop-in center. And I'm proud to say that the community of Esquimalt unanimously voted them a property tax exemption, as we would any other community service organization that was putting in these huge volunteer hours. And I have to say, it wasn't even controversial. Right? The community said, yes, they're performing this very valuable role in our community. I had been on walks with them. They do an annual walk, of which the theme is sex workers' rights equal human rights. They were very surprised that I continued to go on that walk after I became a municipal councillor and then after I became a member of parliament. It's not a large walk, I have to say, and it always attracts not always the right kind of attention. But what they're trying to do is, I think, what we on this House are trying to get people to recognize here, that sex workers come from all kinds of backgrounds. They come from all kinds of life circumstances, and they are Canadian citizens with the right to be treated with dignity and the right to live their lives free from violence.
Exactly.
So as part of my trying to inform myself, because I expected that the Bedford decision would go the way it did, having taught criminal justice for many years, it seemed likely the Supreme Court would throw out these laws around prostitution, which actually made life more dangerous for those involved. So I met with Stella, I met with other national organizations, I met with social science researchers at the University of Victoria in my community, and I learned a lot from all of those. But where I learned the most was I asked Peers if a group of sex workers would be willing to sit down with me and talk for an afternoon about what they thought should happen if the Supreme Court threw out the laws on prostitution. So I spent an afternoon sitting with a group of 12 women actively involved in sex work in my community. And so when people have asked before, do people know sex workers, have they talked to sex workers, I got to know these people very, very well. And I have nothing but respect for them in the way that they are trying to do their best in the circumstances in which they find themselves. Some have chosen to be there, and I do accept when they say they have chosen to be there. Some, like the single mom, have had bad choices and have made the best choice they can, as I said, for their kids. None of the women I met with were trafficked, although all of them knew of indication or of cases where that had happened in the community. But one thing they had in common: they had all experienced violence at some point as a sex worker. And so at the end of that discussion, when I asked them, what should the goal be for legislation, their answer was harm reduction and safety for those involved in sex work. So when this government bill was tabled, I got a call from Peers. And like most MPs, I wasn't able to take it immediately because I was in the House. But when I went back and talked to them, it was a very emotional conversation. they were very, very upset with the legislation they saw tabled. And so I think many of them felt that there were some very good intentions, many people on the other side of the House, but that this bill had missed the mark for them. And they felt very strongly that it would make their lives more difficult and make their lives more dangerous. Yeah. And so when we talk about what some people like to call the Nordic model, they were very clear that criminalizing one half of a transaction inevitably makes the other half dangerous. It'll drive it underground. It'll make it more difficult for them to identify the clients in advance because the clients will become more secretive. All of the various objections that you can imagine that involve safety were raised with me in that phone call. Subsequently, the executive director, Marion Little, made a public statement. And so I actually want to read her public statement because it reflects the conversation that I had with members of the board of directors of Peers when this legislation was introduced. Marion Little said, "This is devastating. People's lives will be affected, and we barely have the resources to help them now. I don't have any confidence those funds the government's talking about will go to experienced organizations providing unconditional care for sex workers."
Exactly.
End quote. Wow. And that's what Peers does. Peers doesn't judge the people who come through the door. They don't judge why they're there, and they don't insist that they're doing anything that needs to be changed. What they say is, how can we help?
Exactly.
Unconditional care for those sex workers.
Right.
So they were opposed to the legislation, and they're worried about the $20 million of funding that the government is talking about, and worried that it'll go to organizations that either have no experience in working with sex workers, who aren't run by sex workers themselves, like Peers is, or organizations who apply a moral stigma at the beginning of their approach to sex workers. So they're very, very concerned about that. So, Mr. Speaker, I've sort of lost track of time. I know you'll advise me at some point that I'm running out of time, but I do have a lot that I want to say in this debate. Because what I'd like to see is the government develop an approach that better protects and offers increased support to women who are involved in sex work. And in addition, on this side, we want to address all those related issues about vulnerable people that have been ignored, like education, addiction treatment, affordable housing, all those things that will enable people who may have ended up in the sex trade and don't want to be there to make better choices for their future. So we have to address those issues which surround the sex trade and the limited opportunities that many women have to take care of themselves, which is what they want to do. So the bill before us would amend the criminal code to create an offense that prohibits purchasing sexual services or communicating in any place for that purpose. Now that's a big concern that the Peers director that I spoke with had. It says any public place. And so where is it that sex workers are going to be forced to practice their trade? Where there are no other people. And if they practice their trade where there are no other people, they are inherently placed in danger. It creates an offense that prohibits the advertisement of sexual services and authorizes the courts to seize materials containing such advertisements and their removal from the internet. One of the things that many of the sex workers I talk to do is they use ads and they use the internet to help screen clients and to help share information about who's dangerous and who's not. They're particularly concerned about, I think the government, again, doing what they quite often do, which is addressing a problem that really doesn't exist when talking about sex work around schools. And I know one commentator who said he'd taken his kids to school thousands of times, and he'd never seen sex workers working, first of all, at those hours, and secondly, around schools. And somehow it casts, again, this aspersion on sex workers that they're some kind of predators after our children. And when, in fact, what I found in my community is many of them have children of their own that they're really trying to provide for. Mr. Speaker, I do not believe that this bill is consistent with the Supreme Court decision on the Charter, and I was very pleased to see the member for Gatineau expressing our position that we'd like to see this referred to the Supreme Court now. Send it to the Supreme Court. The government has the ability to do this. And so instead of wasting many years of battles in court, we could get advice from the Supreme Court at this point, which would say whether or not this meets the tests that they set in the Bedford decision. I personally don't believe it does, but the government must believe it meets those tests, or it would not have introduced the legislation in the House. And if so, there should be no risk for the government in referring this to the Supreme Court if it genuinely believes that it meets the tests of the Bedford decision. The other thing that, again, was expressed directly to me by sex workers from peers in my riding is they wonder who is going to look after sex workers in the meantime while this bill goes through that makes their lives more dangerous and more difficult. So we'll have many more years before this would get to the Supreme Court, 4 or 5 or 6 years. And in the meantime, they feel that this does make their lives more dangerous in ways that were absolutely prohibited by the Supreme Court decision. And so they'd be forced to undergo that violence and be subjected to those negative conditions for an additional 4 to 5 years, when all the Supreme Court really offered or had authorized was 1 year for Parliament to get a new bill together that respects the Bedford decision. And so, again, I would echo the member for Gatineau in her call that this be referred to the Supreme Court now, before it's enacted into law and before it has those damaging impacts. And as I said, if the government doesn't believe that, then I don't understand their reluctance to refer it to the Supreme Court. They've certainly referred other decisions to the Supreme Court, and I know this didn't always go well for them, but obviously they have more confidence in this bill. Others have said to me, well, you surely must support the $20 million that the government has devoting to assisting sex workers. And I would say to that, yes, absolutely, I think that's a great idea.
Where's the money?
I would like to see where that is in the budget. And I would also like to see that it doesn't have strings attached. And again, it's a director of peers who said to me, I'm afraid this money will go to an organization which stigmatizes the sex trade and therefore will not be able to reach the women who most need the help. And so, Mr. Speaker, I don't sense a great appetite for the government to listen on this bill and make changes to the bill. That would be my second choice after referring it to the Supreme Court. And I guess what we will be forced to do as it proceeds on this side is try to make the arguments and attract the government's attention and have them listen to the people who are most at risk, who are placed most at risk by this bill, and that is the sex workers. I want to close by thanking the sex workers in my community for helping me understand the situation of their daily lives and how this bill would actually be a threat to them. And I want to conclude my remarks by saying I look forward to the day when we have a truly inclusive society in Canada which does not stigmatize any of our members and put them at risk of violence. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question